while Ephibo's lifeless body lay on the ground behind him. Victor grabbed his head by the hair and stood silently thinking. At that moment, Victor began to look down, and his eyes filled with confusion as something caught his attention. Ephibo's face started emitting smoke and slowly began to melt, but even so, Victor did not let go of the head. As Victor was holding onto the hair of the face, Ephibo's real head emerged from the disguise, fell to the ground, and started rolling. Our boy simply stood there in silence, trying to understand the situation. Once Victor looked at his hand, he saw that it was not his face but the mask that Ephibo was wearing. He began to observe the mask, and after analyzing it, he realized that this bastard had disguised himself as a human with a fake face. Victor tightly grabbed the mask and his attention focused on Ephibo's head. He started staring at it intently, and Ephibo's real face was disfigured. He was missing an eye and half of his face had no skin. Upon looking more closely, Victor realized that this was Peter's face, but when he examined further, he saw that there was a mole under the eye. He dismissed this theory since Peter did not have this mole. Before regressing, Victor and Peter went to the jungle, and in the middle of the night they lit a bonfire and began to happily converse with each other. Back then, Peter often talked about his missing younger brother. He had disappeared after going into isolation training. But now Victor knew the real reason. He hadn't disappeared because of isolation training, but because a demon had chased him and turned him into an undead. Victor raised his head, and his gaze filled with seriousness as something was approaching. He was in a dark hallway, and beside him lay Ephibo's corpse. From the darkness emerged Eve, who unsheathed her scissors, and Fido, who unsheathed his swords. Both began walking slowly toward our boy. He turned towards them, started observing them, and it didn't take long for him to realize that they could be people he knew. Eve, who had the blade of the scissors resting on his shoulder, and Fido, who was behind him, began staring intently at Victor and remained silent. Several seconds later, with a piercing gaze, they adopted an offensive stance, indicating that they were ready to attack. Upon seeing this, Victor decided not to stand idly by. He drew the Beelzebub sword and began to run quickly towards the demons. This was something they did not expect, and upon seeing that he was ready to attack, both changed their stance and adopted a defensive pose. Victor extended the sword backward, causing the blade to start emitting a powerful red energy, and our boy's eyes filled with rage. He wanted to kill these bastards at all costs in order to finally end the life of the demon Dantalion. Victor approached them, and using all his power, launched a powerful slash. But luckily for them, the demons jumped away, dodging the attack at the last second. Now that our boy was defenseless due to the attack, the demons decided not to waste this opportunity. Fido appeared above and began approaching Victor, preparing to strike, while on the other side, Eve appeared on the ground and prepared to swing the scissors with force. Luckily, Victor turned around just in time, and upon seeing that they were ready to attack, he realized this wasn't good. The demons launched a powerful attack, creating a large smoke screen and making a lot of noise in the middle of the night. At the same time, somewhere else, there was a statue of a goddess praying. This scene was beautiful, as there was a hole in the ceiling and the moon was illuminating the area. Near the statue stood a blonde-haired woman who clasped her hands together and addressed the woman in the statue as Lune. This woman was none other than Dolores. She had come to this place to pray while the moonlight illuminated the area. She began to pray and asked Lune, who resided in the heavens, to forgive them for their sins just as they forgave those who sinned against them. While she was praying, the image of Victor holding the ball and covered in water from the estuary appeared in her mind. She tried to stop thinking about this, but Victor's figure became even larger. She clasped both hands tightly, brought them close to her face, closed her eyes and began blushing like a tomato, and asked Lune not to let them fall into temptation and deliver them from evil. But instead of disappearing, the image of Victor became visible in her mind. She put her hands over her face and while red as a tomato with a lost look started wondering why she kept thinking about him. She was in love with Victor but didn't want to admit it. She decided to leave the prayer for another day, turned her back on the statue and decided to calm down a bit, since after all, Victor was just a good junior. She placed her hand on her chest and with a loving gaze, began thinking about the Night Hound and our boy. But these thoughts were interrupted when suddenly there was a noise. She turned to one side and with a confused look started wondering what was happening. Next to her there was a hallway. The wall broke into pieces and someone's body came flying towards her. Dolores began observing this silently, not knowing what was going on. This person was none other than Victor. She looked with a bit of attention and saw that he was wearing the pandemic mask. Her gaze filled with confusion and surprise, leaving her speechless, realizing that he was the Night Hound. Using his feet, Victor managed to stop his moving body, and once the smoke curtain began to disappear, Heave and Pito appeared. They started approaching him and prepared to attack again. Many questions came to Dolores' mind. She didn't know why the Night Bloodhound was here or why he was fighting against Quilty's guards. She placed one hand over her chest, extended the other towards him and called him by his name, Night Bloodhound. Upon hearing this, Vickers' body began to tremble and his gaze filled with fear. Quickly he started to turn around, and upon seeing Saintess, his expression became confused as he didn't know what she was doing there. While he was distracted, Heave threw the scissors at his chest, causing them to pierce into his body without even giving him time to react. Vickers' body was thrown backward and crashed against the edge of the statue. Dolores turned around, and upon seeing this, her eyes filled with concern as she knew this wasn't good. The attack was so powerful that Vicker lay on the ground, and seeing this, Heave and Pito began to approach and decided to deliver the final blow. But Dolores wasn't going to let this happen. She stood in front of them, extended her hands to the sides, and with a look full of fear asked them to stop. Even though she didn't know what was happening, she was sure that if they talked it out they would reach an agreement. Her persuasion plan did not work against the demons. Both of them started staring at her, grabbed their swords tightly and prepared to take her out of the way. At first she was paralyzed with fear, but then she closed her eyes, clenched her teeth tightly and stood firm, ready to receive the attack. She didn't want to step aside and let Nighthound die. The demons attacked her and Vicker asked her to move aside. Using the Beelzebub sword he blocked Heave's attack, but unfortunately he didn't have another sword, so he blocked the other attack with his own arm, causing Pito's sword blade to sink into his arm. Despite having received so much damage, Vicker's gaze was firm. He began to look at the demons and remained silent. In a matter of seconds, the wound made by the sword caused him to start bleeding. The Saintess, who was behind him, opened one eye to see what was happening, and her gaze filled with fear and sadness upon seeing the wound on Vicker's arm. With a confident look, Vicker asked her not to worry about this. After saying this, he quickly began swinging his sword, breaking Heave's scissor blade into pieces. The demon started watching the fragments of the broken blade in the air, and his eyes filled with confusion. Just before Heave could understand the situation or make a move, Vicker stabbed the sword into his neck, not even giving him a chance to do anything about it. He drove the sword even harder into this bastard's neck to ensure he died, and seeing this, Pito pulled the sword from our boy's arm and prepared to deliver the final blow, thinking he was defenseless. Vicker swung the sword forcefully, cutting Heave's neck, and just before Pito could take advantage of this opportunity to attack, with a piercing gaze, Vicker turned around, swung the sword precisely, and also cut his neck, causing blood to fill the place. While the blood of the demons was falling to the ground, Dolores grabbed her shoulders, clenched her teeth tightly, and her gaze filled with fear. She couldn't believe that the Nighthound was so powerful. Vicker's suit was now covered in blood. Several seconds later, the heads of the demons fell next to their lifeless bodies. Vicker approached, began observing them, and remained silent. Dolores put her hand near her mouth and with a worried look remembered that he was injured. She approached him, clenched her fists, and with a look full of concern asked if he was okay, advising that it would be better to treat his arm right now. Vicker stood firm and told her not to worry about it. After saying this, he turned his head back and began to observe her with a serene gaze. He never would have thought he'd see the Saintess here, nor what she was doing here so late at night. With an expression full of terror, she started looking at the corpses. She didn't know why Quilty's guards had tried to attack her despite knowing who she really was. Vicker started pointing at the heads with his finger and asked her to pay attention. Pito's face began to slowly melt. Dolores put her hand over her mouth, and she couldn't help but feel disgusted. Vicker began to observe the head and revealed that they were undead who were using other people's faces. Dolores started looking at Pito's head, and with a trembling body, she asked why something like this was happening to people affiliated with the Quo Vadis family. With a calm expression, Vicker replied that the Saintess of Quo Vadis should know better than him. Her gaze filled with fear and confusion upon realizing that the bastard Quilty was behind all of this. Vicker removed the masks that Heave and Pito were wearing. He began to observe carefully and remained silent. Pito was a man with black hair and a beard, and his face was familiar to our boy. He was Staffordshire Baskerville from the Pitbull Order. He began to remember Staffordshire when he was alive, when our boy had disappeared into the forest. This guy was able to avoid exemption thanks to Adolf Morg's defense, but he had heard that voluntarily he had gone into isolation training. Vicker clenched his teeth tightly and his eyes filled with fury. He started looking at Heave's corpse and saw that he had a tattoo on his chest, and judging by this he realized that this guy was from the Don Quixote family. He began to remember the bastard set smiling and recalled that this guy was also in isolation training, and people from prestigious families had cut off contact with outsiders. In the past, he came across the three sisters who were very tired, and with a sincere look, one of them mentioned that they had just started isolation training. But, by Uncle Adolf's orders, he withdrew, entered the Room of Darkness, and was currently dedicated to magical research. At that moment, someone wearing bandages extended their hand and summoned a fireball. This person threw the fireball at the corpses of the demons, creating a great explosion, leaving Vikir and Dolores somewhat confused. This person began to throw more fireballs, destroying the place in pieces. Several seconds later, debris started flying everywhere. The entire place was now in flames. Vikir approached Dolores and began to cover her with the cloak. The flames started spreading everywhere, and seeing this, Vikir thought that this was not good. They began to look to one side and their eyes filled with surprise and confusion upon seeing what was in front of them. Someone wearing leather boots started making their way through the fire towards them. It was a woman with red hair. She began walking slowly towards them. Vikir began to observe her and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. He gave her 0 points. He didn't know what this attitude of his future wife was, giving her 0 points out of 100. She started staring at Vikir, extended her hand towards him, summoned a fireball and prepared to attack. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.